Hello and welcome to this first episode of Avalon Woodworks. We need to build a pantry cabinet in a hurry and on a budget. So watch how we go from this to this in a matter of days. We've got our work cut out for us. So this project came about because we moved into a new house with a refrigerator that was way too small for a family of 4. Well, surprise, our new refrigerator came early, and so I had to hurry up and build some food storage. In this case, we're building this project out of 3/4 inch prefinished birch plywood, and I'm using our track saw to cross-cut our pieces into the heights that I need to build our cabinet boxes. Now, no one wants to see us cross-cutting our plywood on the track saw 20 or 30 times, so we're fast-forwarding over here and setting up our table saw to do our rip cuts. In this case, we're going to be ripping along the grain of our 3/4 inch birch plywood. So I'm using a 60-tooth ATB or alternating top bevel blade to give us a nice clean edge and minimize sanding as we get to our finished product. This particular one is through Orange Tools, I believe. These are pretty inexpensive, and I think well worth the money. Definitely a step up from maybe the Diablo blades you might find at Home Depot. Once we've got our riving knife put back in to avoid pinching on the blade, we throw in our zero clearance plate. If I remember, I think this one was a little bit snug. Yep, there we go. Giving it some percussive maintenance. We throw on our blade guard because we like our fingers and we want to keep them. Now earlier, we already cut all of our plywood pieces to height using the track saw, so now I just need to rip them to width. In this case, I believe this is the side panel, or one of the side panels for the tall bottom cabinet. So I just set our table saw to 24 inches, and since I have it dialed in, I know this piece is going to be exactly as wide as I need it to be just by setting the tape to 24 inches. Again, using the blade that we put in there earlier, we just feed it through nice and easy. No extra pressure, keep our fingers away from the blade, and we should end up with a nice, clean, finished edge. Now all we have to do is repeat this 7 or 8 more times to cut out the rest of our pieces, and we'll be ready to assemble our boxes. And yes, before you ask, I'm saving this piece, because if I remember, I think I laid it out so that that's the exact height we need for our toe kick. With all of our pieces cut out, it's time to finally start assembling these cabinet boxes and things will start taking shape. So you notice here I'm using a handy dandy little clip that just happens to keep the sides and the top at the perfect angle. And I'm lining up my edges because I tend to be a little anal retentive about this. And then I'm just going to shoot it together temporarily with some 18 gauge brad nails. But don't worry, these are going to come back and get reinforced with some screws. Oh, and apparently someone was trying to talk to me. By the way, sorry for all the crap you're seeing around there. As I said, we were moving in, and so there's just nowhere to put all of our stuff other than my shop right now. So let's just say it doesn't look like this anymore. Typically, I'll try to shoot a fastener every 6 inches or so. It's probably overkill, but I just want to make sure that these aren't coming apart. I'm also not using glue, that you'll notice. I just haven't really felt the need for it. These are going to be face frame cabinets, so the face frame actually helps hold everything together as well. So yeah, nails and screws typically does just fine. Here you see both sides of the cabinet box are now pinned together with brad nails. So we're going to go through and reinforce with screws. First, I'm going to actually pre-drill with a countersink bit for a couple of reasons. One, we want to make sure that the screws wind up flush with the top so that they're not sticking out. But also because you're going to be drilling screws into plywood, pre-drilling helps make sure that the plies don't split apart and you don't wind up with a big old mess. Now you may be wondering what kind of screws we use to assemble these boxes. I believe at the time I was still using GRK number 8 general purpose screws. You just want to make sure that, at least because we're using plywood, it's a fairly coarse thread. And as far as length, I like to at least double the width of the material that I'm using to make sure we get enough bite. So in this case, since we're using 3/4 plywood, double that, you get 1.5 inches. I believe these are 1.5 inch number 8 screws. It's also worth noting that it's really easy to blow through the side of the boxes with screws if you over tighten. I'm using an impact here, but I've done this enough that I've got a fairly good touch on it. But please be careful or you're going to ruin your project real quick. By this point, the sides and tops of our boxes are pre-assembled, so it's time to start putting the backs together. I've already off camera checked and made sure that all of our connections are good, there's no gaps. And I think here I'm just making sure there's no fuzz on anything before I put the backs on. For these boxes, and I typically use 1/2 inch backs for a couple of reasons. One, they give it a little bit more structure and help square up the boxes and make sure they're not going to move. And then two, it also gives you a really good mounting surface to actually attach to the walls whenever it's time to secure them. Here we see the 1/2 inch piece going up. Making sure everything's square, and just like before, we'll nail it in place with brad nails and then go through and reinforce with screws. Once the backs are attached to our boxes, we set those aside for now and move over to our face frames. In this case, I'm going to be making the face frames out of 3/4 inch thick poplar, and kind of opposite of when I'm breaking down plywood, I like to rip these to width first and then cross cut to length over on the miter saw. So I have switched to a 40 tooth blade here. I did not get a shot of that. But bottom line is you want to use something a little bit more aggressive whenever you're cutting through hardwood. A 60 tooth blade could do it, but on a smaller table saw like this, it would take forever and it would probably leave burn marks. So switching to a more aggressive blade definitely makes life easier. As far as feeding hardwood through the table saw, again, you want to make sure not to use too much pressure. You're basically just putting enough pressure forward to let the blade do its work and keep the feed rate even. You want to avoid stopping and starting because it'll give you extra blade marks. So just even, smooth pressure will give you a nice clean cut. It's also kind of satisfying to watch. And then I'm also using a push stick to finish off this cut because I want to make sure to keep my fingers nice and far away from this blade. And with that, we'll have our first piece of face frame material cut down to our desired 1.5 inch width. Once all of our face frame material is cut to width, we can start breaking it down on the miter saw and get the lengths that we need. In this case, you can see I have a stop set up on the end of the miter saw, so I'm not even really having to measure. I can just butt up against the stop and cut, and I know that my pieces are going to be exact. While we're at it, we're also going to ignore the fact that I forgot to turn on dust collection, so I just snuck in there and did it. Now, I'm not sure why, but this next section recorded in a time lapse, so I'm just going to talk you through it. The first thing we did was we took the long ends of our face frame material and pre-drilled with a pocket hole jig. And then here you're going to see me zap them together with some pocket hole screws. You'll also notice everything is clamped down to make sure that it's nice and flat. Again, we seem to have had some camera issues, so the face frame assembly video just kind of disappeared. But here, everything's already been assembled and it's face down. And I'm sanding the backs just to make sure that everything is nice and flush. Bottom line is we want to make sure the material is really flat with no gaps so that whenever we assemble it to the boxes themselves, it just looks like it's one finished piece. The last thing that I like to do before priming and painting my face frames and doors is just break the corners with a 1/16 inch roundover bit on a trim router. Some people do this by hand with sandpaper. No matter how you do it, you just want to make sure to break the corners, otherwise you're going to have issues with it hanging on to paint during the finish process. So here we're jumping ahead a bit. I've already primed the face frame itself. You didn't miss anything, it's the exact same process. Normally I would actually spray face frames with a sprayer, but since this is such a small project, there's literally only one face frame connecting the lower and upper cabinet, I just decided to do this by hand. Plus, it kind of gives you a nice little brush effect if that's what you're going for. I start by doing all the insides of the face frame first, just to make sure that they're covered. You don't want to go too heavy when you're actually doing the faces themselves, or you get a little bit of drips. So I like to make sure that the sides are coated first so that gravity's not working against me. Simply rinse and repeat, and about 10 minutes later, the first coat of our face frame is done. One more coat, and this thing will be ready to install. So, just because my hands were full, I did not get a chance to actually show how I installed the cabinet boxes to the walls. I can go into that later in another video if there's interest, but here you can see I'm actually using some band clamps to hold the face frame in place while I'm nailing it. You also can't really see it, but I have an aluminum spacer block in my left hand that I'm just using to make sure that the face frame overhang is enough to cover the finished end panel that I'm going to be adding later. I'm also just using 18 gauge brad nails to nail the face frame to the cabinet. There are cleaner ways to do this, but I was trying to do this as fast as possible, so I don't mind going back and filling in the nail holes and then repainting them later. You may also be wondering why I'm attaching a face frame to a cabinet that's already full of stuff. As I had said earlier, our fridge came earlier than expected, so we had to have something to use to put our food. I just dropped it. I was just kind of sliding that spacer block up and down to make sure that the face frame spacing over the side was the exact 3/4 spacing that I needed. After doing the same thing and working my way across the face frame, this is nearly attached to our cabinet and almost ready for use. By the way, how about that wallpaper, huh? It is since all gone, but I'm not kidding when I say literally almost this entire house was covered in wallpaper. Someone loved that stuff. Here we're going back and filling in those nail holes with some nice wood putty. It'll dry nice and hard, and then we can sand down and use some touch-up paint. There are ways to attach face frames using biscuits or clamps where you don't need to go through and do this, but again, this was a small project and we were trying to do it quick. So I didn't mind doing this fill and then just doing touch-up paint. Here you see our boss and chief designer coming to inspect our work and make sure that we're doing everything properly. And after a little bit of touch-up paint, the first stage of this project is now complete. All that's left to do on this next episode is build the doors and drawers. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week on Avalon Woodworks.